I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem like the Magnus we're used to, where he just beats everybody no matter the position. But I think it's a fine choice. He's like, I'm only slightly better. I get the white pieces now, and I think he believes that with the first move advantage, he could take down Hikaru.
Whoa. And a King's Indian from Hikaru Nakamura in game 2. If you're familiar with Hikaru's career, you would not be surprised at that choice. At some point, Hikaru was playing the King's Indian almost exclusively. He scored countless brilliant victories in over-the-board chess. And the big surprise, Robert, is not the opening choice. It's what Magnus has just played, bishop to d3, rather than the typical bishop e2. What do you make of this?
And it's the small things that make the biggest difference at the highest level. Look at that. Bishop d3, dragging the bishop out to g4, and then bishop e2. That looks like a loss of a tempo, but what is gained? That light square bishop is so important in the King's Indian. If the bishop takes the knight on f3, you're not going to get your typical attack when you eventually move your knight away from f6, push your pawn to f5, and storm on the king side. So black does not want to capture this knight on f3. So Magnus does what Magnus does best. He kind of lures his opponent into an unknown position, that deep, dark forest that Mikhail Tal liked to talk about. And he said there's only room out for one of us.
And Leela, that's a great quote. One of my favorites. Leela and Stockfish, they have breathed new life from the white side of the King's Indian. I have to begrudgingly admit, as a biased King's Indian player myself, but they have found so many new variations, obscure lines that seem to give white a small but stable advantage. And you can see Magnus dropping his knight away, forcing the exchange of light squared bishops. And that doesn't mean, Robert, that Hikaru is not going to try to go f5. It's just going to be a lot harder to infiltrate down the light squares with the bishop now absent from the board.
It's just a lot less scary, right? Because f5 can always be met by f3. And one of the big features of the King's Indian defense is that dark square bishop for black is bad. I'm sorry to say it, Danya. I know
Robert,
this is your
you
beloved opening.
Tone in the,
I
we're
say it out of
the finals here.
Respect and love, but that bishop on g7 is one only a mother could love, because it's stuck behind a pawn on e5. That is why sometimes you want a pawn break. It opens the board up. And look at this move, g4. You want to play f5? I dare you. Come at me, because gf, then it will open the g file, and that bad bishop on g7 I was just talking about will get in some big trouble.
And I'm almost positive Hikaru is going to switch his attention to the other side of the board. Let's bring up our first analysis board of the day. I'll show you what can happen if you play f5. This is unthinkable. You never play f5 if it allows the g file to open. White can simply take twice. And we're not talking about the positional concessions black makes, giving up this massive e4 square for white's knights. Look at the g file. Rook g1. Let's say black plays a random move, and you can already resign after rook takes g7 and queen g4 with the knight sinking its teeth into e4 on the next move. Robert, Hikaru didn't even take a second to think about f5, and as predicted, he situates his knight on c5 instead.
Yeah, it's why we study our openings, right? Hikaru Nakamura hasn't memorized this position, but he has a great fundamental understanding that f5 is too dangerous. Now, he might need to play that move just to get some semblance of activity, because what can you do on the other side of the board? You would like to push your pawn a5 back to a6 and play the move b7 to b5, but you can't do that. Pawns don't go backwards in chess, unfortunately. How else do you crack open that side of the board? Maybe c6, but c6 comes at a cost. The d6 pawn will be a long-term weakness. You're still not getting the move b5 in, so white has a free hand on the king side, Danya, where black has absolutely nothing to show for on the queen side.
And black needs to get down to business to defeat the Huns here, because if he doesn't, the attack is coming at a furious pace. Magnus is about to play h5 and open up the h file, and you basically have, if you're Hikaru, 3 or 4 tempi maximum to create some intrigue on the other side of the board. You can see Hikaru desperately trying, but Magnus, he calmly brings his knight to b1. Why is he doing that? Why is he contorting himself like that? It's to stop b7, b5, which is one of the only options that black has to open up the queen side, and the knight on c3 is integral in stopping that advance from happening.
You know, contortionists usually freak me out. It scares me what they do with their bodies. But I'm loving the way that white is maneuvering those knights. The knight back to b1. Wesley So did this against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. We talked about it a lot. He knows where to put his pieces. The knight is best placed on c3 here. And now, again, white has nothing to fear on the queen side. King b1 looks like a generally useful move, just in case black has any ideas of opening up the queen side. And you're just pointing this out. Black now closes the king side, and look at the Petrosian king march. That king is going away from the queen side to e1, to f1, to g2, where it will just sit safely on the king side. And then when white is ready to strike, well, Magnus trying to push pawns on the queen side.
And I think the real reason he's marching his king, as you point out, is to go from defending to attacking on the queen side. But it's also to liberate this knight. Where does the knight really belong? Where the knight is eyeing this beautiful f5 square where it's going to lord over the entire king side. Well, you couldn't do that easily with your king on the queen side because of b7, b5. And Hikaru is reminding Magnus of what is going to happen the moment he moves his knight away from c3. But Robert, I just want to point out, h6 by Hikaru was a necessary move. That was a really, really strong idea that freezes the king side and gives Hikaru the time he needs to set things up on the other side of the board. The engine might give +2 here, but it's actually incredibly hard to make progress, even though you're positionally dominating.
You're going to use that word fortress. Magnus Carlsen of years past may not believe in it, but Hikaru Nakamura certainly does. And the reason why, how can you make progress? You need a pawn break. Where's the pawn break going to come from? You can never play the move f2 to f4 because black has both of the pawns staring there. And similarly, black can never play f7 to f5 for the same reason. So the king side remains completely locked. What about the queen side? Maybe an eventual pawn a3, pawn b4, but that seems forever away, especially because black is ready to meet that. And he plays a4.
There we go.
If you play a3, you'll never play b4. If you play pawn b2 to b3, thank you for opening up the queen side. My rook on a8 is developed in its starting home, and then knight moves out the way, and there will be some activity.
And Magnus has to be a little bit careful because 2 can play at that game. He strikes first with b4. He waited until the precise moment that Hikaru was ready to play b5. This is White's last opportunity to push the b pawn, and he does. I love that decision from Carlsen. Robert, I think if Hikaru could squeeze b5 in, we could soon start having a completely different conversation. With the king side locked up, it might very well have been black who would have held all the cards on the queen side. As it stands, Magnus will get a rook to b3 in the event of an en passant. And then b5 will once again be virtually unachievable, especially if a pawn lands on a4.
This is getting very bad for Hikaru. So he plays the move b6. I think it's a very smart play. He wants to keep the position as locked as possible. If the move b5 is played by white here, the knight goes back to c7. And then the question becomes where to make progress. There are no pawn breaks. The issue for black is this pawn on a4. It sticks out. And that's why the move a3 was played, both to defend the b4 pawn. At some point, as you're highlighting, the queen is going to come to c2. That pawn may go from b4 to b5, and the a4 pawn may collapse. So that's the thing that needs to be looked out for. However, Anya, we should not forget the g4 pawn. You beat me to it. You know where my mind's going, that the queen on e2 is doing an important task.
And we know where Magnus's mind is going, and we know where his king is going. It's going to defend the g4 pawn to free up the queen so that it can move to c2 and attack the a4 pawn. And Robert, engines are still very bad in these types of positions. Stockfish was myopically suggesting the move b5 leading to a totally locked positions. Engines don't always understand the concept of not being able to make progress. Magnus, of course, is going to keep his pawn on b4 in order to open up the possibility of reopening the queen side at his convenience. Hikaru is in dire straits here.
He certainly is, but our viewership is sky high through the roof. Over 100,000 viewers across YouTube, Twitch, and all the platforms. Thank you so much. We are just getting started. The fun is just beginning. And the fun may be getting started for Magnus Carlsen because it's right now, it's tied, a draw in the first game. And after a takes b4 here, black is sitting very passively. The pawn on a4 will be captured, I believe, right now. But if knight takes a4, Danya, there may be the response b6 to b5. Yep. c4 pawn is pinned to the queen over there on c2.
There's an incredible idea that involves taking on a4 and then actually sacking the knight, driving the c-pawn up to c6 and banking on the protected and connected passers. But we'll cross that bridge if we get there. Magnus, he needs to defend the c4 pawn. Robert, I have been very impressed with Hikaru's defense here in the early going. He is challenging Magnus. He is posing problems, and he's trying to get this into a time scramble.
Right, and b5 played by Magnus. Take your knight, if it goes to b8, it's trapped there. It's not getting out anytime soon. But if it goes up to c5, then white can take on c5. And I actually think this is quite ingenious in many ways. The a4 pawn is dropping, but even if it weren't, Danya, that knight on c3, we like to think of dream squares. The knight might land on f5, and guess what? Or c6, as you're pointing out.
C6.
And yeah, light squares, dark square bishop. Good luck parrying off that threat. It is going to be very unpleasant.
You got Bali on f5. You got Hawaii on c6. That knight has prospects. And right now, Magnus needs to get rid of Hikaru's knight on c5, take the pawn on a4. And Magnus, well, he's got to make sure that he keeps the c4 pawn defended. This might be the only tender spot in White's entire position. Most importantly here, White is really in no hurry. Magnus could take his time to get this knight around, again, either to f5. c6, I think, is a little bit more accessible, although it's not too hard to get to f5 either. As long as you defend this pawn, which he just did, you could start the maneuvering process right about now. But Hikaru, he prepares to grab control of the a file, which may be his only asset at this point.
Well, there's a dual threat. The a file and rook takes b5 was a threat because the queen was loose on c2. So if White makes a move, let's say we're at a free turn with knight d1, immediately rook takes b5 is available because the c4 pawn is pinned to the white queen. But the queen moved to e7. It wants to go to f6 and up to f4, causing that white king some problems. But Danya, I think it's just scary looking, but not scary in principle. And Magnus down to 18 seconds. He's got to find a way out.
Listen, scary looking things actually become scary when you've got 10 seconds on your clock. The enemies become magnified, and Hikaru is second to none at twisting you into a knot, even if you're completely winning when you're down to those last seconds. Rook to a3 pins the knight, and suddenly Black getting really active here. Queen f4 coming next.
Rook b3, you lose the c4 pawn. We swap rooks and c4 drops. Queen f4. He goes backwards. Queen f4 is a huge move, and Black suddenly has the upper hand, but he goes rook 8. That was a big missed opportunity for Hikaru Nakamura.
Queen f4 forced the favorable queen trade because the e-pawn would have captured, opening up a pathway for the black bishop. But we've moved on from that. This is still a game, and Magnus is very close to getting his knight to that promised land on f5, and he does.
Oh, this is terrible for Black because now you're just getting squished. You have no space for your pieces. And don't be surprised if White makes the move c4 to c5 at some point, a la Vasil Ivanchuk, Garry Kasparov. It's a clearance move. You get a pass pawn. So look for that option at some point for White.
But Magnus, he's dilly-dallying. He's trying to build some time up on his clock. It's time for c5. I think it's his only break. He has no other way to make progress.
He can't play the move. I understand he might be a little bit nervous about it. He's just trying to keep consistent on the clock, moving his rook back with queen e3 again. Now c5
repetition is on the cards.
Strong.
And he's got to be careful to avoid 3-time repetition.
I think he'll be okay with it. I think he sees the position as being locked up. He just wants to escape without losing. Ooh, rook b3 to c4 pawn's a little bit loose, but not actually capturable.
And I don't know with 2 seconds, is he going to decide on c5? He decides to exchange rooks, but he gives up the pawn. Oh my gosh. And he's given up another one.
I think it's just a draw. Queen e1, and we have a draw by repetition.
Oh my lands, and Magnus doesn't decide on c5. It was difficult to calculate the ramifications, especially against Hikaru. It's a draw by perpetual check.